Hello, my darlings. Tonight we're stepping away from comic books, we're stepping away from horror movies and stories, and we're stepping into another story that has absolutely consumed the Lego collecting community. A story involving an estimated $200,000 collection. A story involving lawsuits, police investigations, a franchise business, internet creators, and court orders. And enough twists and turns to make even the most seasoned collector stop and ask, what in the world is going on? Now, before we begin, I want to make something very clear. This video is based on publicly available reports, court records, public statements, and published videos. Some claims discussed remain disputed. Some matters are still being argued, and where facts are contested, I will tell you. Because tonight, we're not here for rumors. We're here for the timeline, to understand how this story exploded across YouTube and social media. We first need to understand Bricks and Minifigs. For those unfamiliar, Bricks and Minifigs is a franchise business built around Lego. Customers buy, sell, and trade Lego sets, parts, and minifigures. Think of it like a comic shop dedicated entirely to Lego. Collectors bring in items, stores purchase inventory, rare pieces change hands, and trust becomes one of the most important currencies in the entire hobby. Because unlike walking into a retail store and buying something new off the shelf, many of these transactions involve collections built over years, sometimes decades. Collections that hold tremendous monetary value, and sometimes tremendous sentimental value. That brings us to the collection at the center of this controversy. Reports emerged involving a massive Lego collection estimated by some sources to be worth around $200,000. $200,000! Now, if you're not a Lego collector, that number may sound ridiculous, but collectors understand. Just like comic books, just like trading cards, vintage toys, certain Lego sets can become highly desirable after retirement, where minifigures can command astonishing prices, and complete collections built over years can become significant assets. The collection at the center of this story was not a handful of plastic bricks. It was a serious collection, the kind of collection that represents years of effort, money, and passion. As details began emerging, disputes arose regarding ownership, possession, and the handling of inventory connected to the collection. Questions began appearing, collectors started asking questions, community members started asking questions, and before long, those questions spread across social media. What initially appeared to be a local dispute suddenly became something much larger. Because when collectors believe something is right, they start digging. Sometimes they find things, sometimes they don't. But once the spotlight appears, everything changes. And that's exactly what happened here. What began as a dispute involving collections soon expanded into a story involving legal action, public accusations, internet investigations, and eventually national attention within the Lego community. But the real explosion had not happened yet, because next, a creator known as Reckless Ben entered the picture. And when that happened, the entire story took a turn nobody could ever predict it. Now, my darlings, every collector community has something in common. Whether it's comic books, trading cards, coins, vintage toys, or even Lego. Eventually, someone starts asking questions. And in the age of social media, those questions don't stay local for very long. As discussions surrounding the collection continued, more and more collectors began paying attention. People wanted answers, people wanted receipts, people wanted documentation, and perhaps most importantly, people wanted transparency. Then the story crossed paths with someone who specializes in turning internet mysteries into public investigations. A creator known as Reckless Ben. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Reckless Ben, he isn't exactly known for avoiding controversy. His channel has built a reputation around investigations and information and challenging organizations that he believes deserve additional scrutiny. And when he became aware of the growing concern surrounding this story, he started digging. At first glance, this may have appeared to be a simple dispute, a disagreement, a misunderstanding, maybe even something that would eventually be settled quietly. But the deeper people looked, questions about inventory, questions about ownership, questions about business practices, questions about how events unfolded. And once those questions entered the public sphere, thousands of viewers began asking them too. Now here's where things get interesting, because once a story enters YouTube, it changes. It stops being a private dispute, it stops being a local disagreement, moment, and it becomes something much larger. Every document gets examined, every statement gets analyzed, every video gets scrutinized, every contradiction gets discussed, and every new development gets amplified. As more content appeared online, viewers began following the story almost like a documentary series. Each update generated more attention, more speculation, more discussion, and more pressure. People on all sides began defending their positions. Supporters formed, critics formed, arguments exploded across social media, and suddenly a dispute that many people outside the legal community had never heard about became one of the most talked about stories in the hobby. Throughout this process, it's important to remember something. Public attention doesn't automatically determine who's right. It doesn't automatically determine who's wrong either. Popularity is not evidence. Views are not evidence. Comments are not evidence. Documentation matters. Evidence matters. And that's why this story continued to evolve. Because as the public investigation intensified, the situation moved beyond internet debate, legal actions began appearing, court filings entered the conversation, takedown efforts became part of the story, and what started as a dispute over a collection was now becoming something far bigger, a battle over information itself. And then, the story took another turn, because the controversy would eventually reach beyond collectors, beyond YouTube, beyond Lego, and into the legal system itself, a place where accusations carry real consequences, a place where evidence matters, and a place where every decision becomes part of the public record. And that's where our story heads next, because before we can talk about police involvement, before we can talk about the footage, before we can talk about the questions that still remain, we need to talk about what happened when the controversies collided with the legal system. Up until this point, my darlings, if you still convince yourself this was simply a dispute, a disagreement, a business conflict, something unfortunate but ultimately ordinary, then the police enters the story, and that's when people outside the legal community started paying attention. Now before we continue, I want to be very careful here. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm not here to tell you who's guilty. I'm not here to tell you who's innocent. What I am here to do is explain why so many people became interested in what happened next. Because when collectors began watching police interactions connected to the story, many viewers walked away with questions. Lots of questions. The internet did what the internet always does. It slowed footage down. It replayed conversations. It examined statements. It compared timelines. And before long, people began debating whether the situation had been handled appropriately or not. Some viewers believed authorities were simply responding to a complicated dispute. Others believed important questions were not being answered. Others felt the investigation should have gone further, and others felt it should never have become a police matter in the first place. Regardless of where people landed, one thing became very clear. The controversy was no longer confined to collectors discussing Lego. It had become something larger. A story involving business relationships, property disputes, public accusations, internet investigations, legal actions, and now, police involvement. Every new development raised additional questions. Questions that many people still believe remain unanswered. As more information emerged, public debate intensified. Supporters of different sides argued over evidence. Viewers analyzed statements. Defenders challenged accusations. And with every new video, every new filing, every new piece of information, the controversy continued to grow. Now, whether you agree with the critics or whether you agree with the responses, I think most people can agree on one thing. The sheer scale of the situation is astonishing. We're talking about a story that began with plastic bricks, and somehow evolved into lawsuits, investigations, public controversy, and a national attention. And that, my darlings, brings us to the final chapter. Because once you step back and look at the entire timeline, once you examine the collection, the dispute, the legal battles, the public investigations, the police involvement, and the fallout that followed, you're left with one unavoidable question. How did it ever get this far? My darlings, we've talked about the collection. We've talked about the dispute. We've talked about the internet investigations. We've talked about lawsuits. We've talked about takedown attempts. We've talked about public controversy. And we've even talked about police involvement. Now let's step back for a moment, because sometimes when you're living through the story, you don't realize how strange it actually is. It's only when you look at the entire timeline from beginning to end that the true scale becomes visible. What began as a dispute involving a Lego collection eventually became one of the most talked about stories in the collector community. A story that spread across YouTube, a story that generated countless hours of discussion, a story that reached far beyond Lego collectors, and a story that continues to raise questions even today. As a collector myself, that's the part I find fascinating. Not because of the drama, not because of the controversy, but because of what it reveals. Collecting is built on trust. Comic books, trading cards, coins, vintage toys, Legos. None of these hobbies function without trust. Trust that agreements will be honored, trust that inventory will be accounted for, trust that records will be maintained, trust that collectors will be treated fairly. The moment trust breaks down, everything becomes chaos. And perhaps that's why this story resonated with so many people, because beneath all the headlines, beneath all the videos, beneath all the arguments, there's a fear every collector understands. The fear of losing something you spent years building. And I don't know where the story ultimately ends. I don't know what future developments may occur. I don't know what information may emerge tomorrow. What I do know is that this story has become a case study in what happens when trust collapses and public scrutiny takes over. And whether you're a Lego collector, a comic book collector, or simply someone watching from the sidelines, there are lessons here. Document everything. Keep records. Take photographs. Protect your inventory. Protect your collection. And never assume a handshake is enough when serious money is involved. Because when you look at everything we've discussed, the collection, the allegations, the lawsuits, the public pressure, the police involvement, the franchise fallout, you can't help but ask yourself one simple question. How did all of this come about? An estimated $200,000 Lego collection. How does a collection of plastic bricks become a story involving lawsuits, public investigations, police involvement, internet creators, and national attention? And perhaps the strangest part of all, I think that Lego collection was worth far more. Good night, my darlings. And until next time,